Conservative. Constitutional. It's the Andrew Cooperrider Show, keeping you informed on what's going on right here in Kentucky.
Today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show, DEI is undergoing an attempted rebrand, of course, as more people understand exactly what DEI is. This isn't the first time they've rebranded it. Why do they keep doing this? I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with feckless and completely incapable legislators on the conservative side. And speaking of feckless and incapable politicians, the Republican Party of Kentucky Building Fund is over $3 million. They unveiled what they plan to do with that money. We'll take a look at where that money came from and just how it points to everything that's wrong right now with the Republican Party, especially in Kentucky, but all over, is having these issues. And then finally, we'll have a op-ed from a pastor in the Herald Leader I want to go over real quick. That was about the 10 Commandments in schools, kind of spurring it on, as well as a few other things happening around the country. They decided to say that putting the 10 Commandments and religion in schools at all is blasphemous. So-called pastor says. So we'll have all that and more today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Before we dig into it, please head on over to your review section. If you're listening to this on a podcast format, make sure you leave a review, subscribe if you haven't, and make sure you're sharing the show with others. If you want to reach out to the show, feel free to email info@theandrewshow.com. Once again, that's info@theandrewshow.com. You can also head on over to theandrewshow.com and hit the contact tab. So rebranding of DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think most of you know exactly what DEI is. It's basically wrapping in critical race theory and the LGBTQ gender theory into one package in order to push it into corporate America and into our schools and universities. And the fact that you know what DEI is and you know what CRT is, and to a degree you probably understand what gender theory is exactly why the left can no longer use those words. Because what happens when you're dealing with complicated ideas in politics is it makes it where a politician can't really run on it, and it makes it to where citizens then don't call for people to do something about it. There's an information campaign that has to go on for people to understand what exactly is happening in their politics in order for it to be changed. For those of you who are unaware, from time to time I make political ads, not just for myself, but for other campaigns and people who maybe they're running some lean campaigns, but I agree overall with what they're doing, so I'll help them out by making them some ads. And one of the difficulties you have when you're trying to communicate something politically is you only get a 30-second time slot for a video ad, or 15 seconds even, or you only have a short, when you send out a mailer, the card's relatively small and it can't have too many words on it or people aren't going to listen, or a door hanger. And the chances and opportunities that people will actually sit there and listen to a politician ramble on for hours and hours and hours isn't going to be there. And so ideas and concepts have to be understood for politicians to be able to run on them and for citizens to demand somebody do something about them, because, well, if they don't understand it, well, they're not going to call for it. And so what happens, you have critical race theory, CRT, and that comes out, and then there's a information giving campaign. Finally, the mainstream media on the right side of things kind of picks it up, the Fox and other people. They begrudgingly realize that it's kind of important, maybe not even begrudgingly, maybe they just decide that it's something worth talking about somewhat because they have 24 hours a day of news to fill. And so if they have some subject now they can talk about, that's great. And same with ONN and Newsmax and all these other places. They say, hey, look, we've got 24 hours of programming to fill. Let's go ahead and fill it with this. You've got the talk show hosts. They have 3 hours a day they have to fill. And so they're going to want to dig into these kinds of things and inform them, because, you can dig into something like critical race theory, talking about its history and the place where it was founded and all this information on it, and legitimately get like an hour's worth of content out of it, if I'm to be honest. And so because of their desire and need to fill content, while at the same time the populace's interest in knowing about these things especially on the right side of things when it comes to things like critical race theory, they will do an information campaign of helping people understand. Then once people understand what CRT is, what critical race theory is, now a politician can run on banning CRT in our schools or addressing critical race theory in our colleges and universities or addressing critical race theory in our government. But you understood once people picked up on it and they're like, oh, I know what CRT is. They're like, oh man, now we have to change. Now we need DEI. So they changed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. That sounds nice initially, and it takes a few years before people truly understand what DEI is, the evils of it, and then they repackage it. And right now they're trying to repackage this as IED, inclusion, equity, and diversity. They're also doing, by the way, they're trying to repackage, of course, that green energy kind of initiatives, the ESG scores, the environmental social governance scores that dealt with green energy, as well as your diversity scores, as well as, do you do the bidding of the government well enough? Those ESG scores for financing, they're kind of doing away with that. Instead, they're rebranding that as well. And so DEI, though, getting a rebrand as inclusion, equity, and diversity, IED. And the idea behind this, of course, the words don't really change, but at the same hand, the initials sound different. And so when they just casually talk about it, IED, well, the general populace won't necessarily pick up on what it is. And so that becomes a problem. It's not about any kind of inclusion. It's not about actual diversity. It's just literally about anti-white, specifically anti-male white. And you need but just do a little bit of research and see how they're using terms like diversity to understand exactly how this concept is being used. Because if you just, for an example, you go on Google and you Google 40% DEI boards, what you'll find is people talking about companies having a 40% diverse board, or you'll hear them say or see them say, oh, we're 60% diverse board. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Either the board is diverse or it's not. The board's one entity. You can't have, 40% of the board is diverse. What does that even mean? That's like saying, that'd be like me saying, 40% of my body is healthy. Well, no, your whole body then is unhealthy. What are you talking about? And so either a board is diverse or it's not. Either you care about diversity or you don't. I don't think it's intelligent to really care what the physical appearance or gender of the people leading a company is. I think you should really just care about, are they competent and able to get the job done, and cast all the rest of it to the side. That's just my humble opinion. But just the way they speak about it, it's clearly meant to be a stand-in for anti-white, anti-heterosexual, and anti-male individuals. Because if those people, quote unquote, have power, those people may be conservatives. They may push a conservative belief. They have traditional family values maybe, and we don't want traditional family values running the world anymore because, we want to tear it all down. And so when people start to understand it, they go ahead, they switch it up. But this means now, and it's pretty effective, it's been pretty effective in stopping a fight against things like DEI and CRT, because, you never really get it addressed at the legislative level, at the base, the damaging ideologies, they never get addressed. And so by repackaging it, now there's a new information campaign, and because politicians and the people we're electing aren't looking at these ideas and saying, oh, that's evil. Oh, that's awful. Oh, that isn't what tax dollars should be spent on. That's not what our time should be spent on. They're looking at anything that they're doing and saying, who's keeping me in office? Who's lining my pocket on this issue? And the thing is about fighting things like DEI and CRT and now IED and all the three-letter acronym BS, leftist BS. Well, there's no real money in it. So conservative, quote unquote, pretend, but Republican representatives only end up fighting it when their base of voters know enough about it, and they're like, okay, I guess I'll at least pretend to do something for you because I don't want to be able to be attacked on this. This is something that my enemies could use against me if I don't do something about this. So I'll at least pretend to do something about it so I can create a good line on a mailer or a good line in an ad saying, I fought XYZ, and then all you dummies will vote for me, so I'll at least pretend to do something. But they're not doing it because they have some sort of principled problem with the ideologies there. And so when there's a re-education campaign and then the people start to cry out, well, now the politicians, it starts all over. The politicians don't really pick up and do it. And as evidence of just how slow reacting our legislature is and how they really don't do anything at the Kentucky state level, well, just look at how they've addressed things like CRT. You know, I've talked about it before on the show, but the DEI bills that were proposed this last year to deal with DEI, these destructive ideologies in our colleges and universities, public colleges and universities, and also there was bills proposed to deal with this in our public schools. Now, the colleges and universities bill actually moved, meanwhile, our public schools don't. It's so funny how the thing that's actually like legally required for everybody to somehow take part in some way, right? You don't necessarily have to go to public school, obviously, but you do legally have to send your kid to some sort of education. So you'd think that the thing you kind of had to legally take part of and that everybody has to fund 100%, that literally nobody's like paying for out of pocket public schools when they go to it, that's completely taxpayer funded. You think that would be the first place where we try to address these ideologies being taught, but instead our legislature decided to focus mainly on colleges and universities, and even then they didn't get it done. Or rewind to a few years ago when their so-called anti-CRT bill passed that left the teachers' unions just laughing at us because it didn't stop them from doing anything, but it satiated the right. That was something that the Louisville Teachers Union boss wrote in an op-ed in the Courier-Journal about that particular effort. So, my point here is that you have the slow-reacting, do-nothing legislature. So as long as you keep repackaging, well, you can keep it going. And yesterday I talked a bit about the old guard. And I talked about how, you know, we are really where we're at because of just their absolute failures of the old guard. And this is the Republican establishment right now, as you would say. And of course, they're doing everything to hold control. They're going to push out the young people. That's why you go to a Republican Party meeting, you look around, and every single person there is, you know, over the age of 55. Like, there are no young people. There might be one young person. And then that one young person shows up and decides to put up with all the garbage that goes on with the party and the fact that it's just completely nothing like what, you know, the grassroots conservative young people want to see in their party. They just deal with that anyways. They end up getting all the things shoved on them. They end up having to do all the work because, you know, the older people can't figure it out. And so you'd think that they'd look at that and say, you know what? How do we bring in more of these young, excited people? Why do we look around and we see that everybody in here is really old? And I don't mean that, you know, in a negative way. I think there's a lot of honor and things to be seen about being older. There's no problem with being older, don't get me wrong, but specifically this old way of thinking. But they believe that they're right. They believe that their viewpoints are the correct ones, despite the fact that the entire reason why our country is the way that it is, despite the fact that the entire reason why I'm unsure of what kind of future I'll be able to hand off to my son is because of the generations before us stood by while the left went on the march. And so we need to pick it up and say what we're doing isn't working. And you know what? Large parts of our massive conservative majority out there, large parts of the conservatives all across this nation and right here in Kentucky, they actually do recognize this. Regardless of their age, they recognize that this isn't working. What we were doing before isn't working. We need to be more active. They are. And they're leading the way, and it's fantastic. But for some reason, those in the Republican Party don't want to deal with it anymore. They don't want to deal with it because they care more about, hey, what's going to line our pockets? What's going to make us feel special? What gives us the nicest stuff? Because that's what it's really about. Politics to them is really just about the perks and feeling special and important. And that's why the state party is very proud of itself, very, very proud of itself, that it has over $3 million in its building fund in order to build a new building. I mean, they are really proud. I'm seeing establishment hacks online talking about how far the Republican Party of Kentucky has come and blah, 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 blah. And now what's funny, of course, now the building fund, for those of you who are unaware, the Republican Party of Kentucky building fund is a political fund that can only be used for the building. So you can't use this to run political ads. You can't use this to run mailers. You can't even use this to help get people elected. You know, some people would make an argument, because I'm about to dive into who's giving them money and how they shouldn't take this money. And so some people would say, look. Just because you take someone's money in politics doesn't mean you have to do their bidding. Take their money, win elections, and then just when they ask you to do something, don't do it. One, that'd be a great thing to say, but we all know how the human psyche works. And, well, quite honestly, when have we ever seen the Republican Party establishment take money and then not do whatever the bidding wants them to do, the bidding of whoever gave them the money wants them to do? I don't really think that's happened, but putting that to the side. This isn't, though, about money being used to win elections. You can't even make that claim. Take the money. That doesn't mean you had to do what they ask you to do. You can't make that claim at all. This is money just used so you can have a nicer office. So the people in power within the party can feel like they're super special and they have this real nice place. And so they bring in this over $3 million into their building fund, and they're very, very exciting about it. And what's funny, too, is they call the building there in Frankfurt the McConnell building, because Mitch McConnell, provided a lot of the donations to it as well. But, it's funny that they would call it the Mitch McConnell building, even though Mitch McConnell, and this is the other thing you hear from the establishment all the time. You'll hear them talk about, in Republican Party here in Kentucky, you'll hear them talk about all the great things McConnell's done for the party and how McConnell really delivered the majority. Like, they really believe that the reason why Republicans in the state legislature are in the power is because Mitch McConnell made it happen. Like, they really think that. Now, of course, they're going to have to think that because a lot of them were either employed by Mitch McConnell, a part of that effort at the time, and so they don't want to sit there and admit that they made no difference. Right? But as I've pointed out before, Mitch McConnell did nothing to actually flip our house. Mitch came into office in the Senate in 1985. So after almost 20 years in office, how many Republican legislators in the House was there in 2004? Well, there were 43. So you can't even, I'm not even going to go back to 85. I don't have to. Because back in 85, when he actually took office, I could go in and say, hey, they only had this many people, and then over his length of time they didn't get anywhere. I can make that claim, and it would be accurate. But, you could say, well, look, Mitch was trying to get his feet under him. He wasn't really as powerful as he is now. He wasn't this fundraising force. He wasn't as organized. He didn't have his statewide apparatuses set up. So let's look at after 20 years in office. It's 2004. There's 43 Republicans in the state house. After 10 years, so now Mitch has been in office 30 years, how many Republicans were in the state house? 46. 46. He gained all of 3 in 10 years. Then suddenly, come 2016, Trump comes onto the scene, and the majority, and we go from 46 in 2014 to now, in 2024, 80 seats. He gained 34 seats in 10 years. And that isn't because of Mitch McConnell. It's because of Trump. The building should be called Trump headquarters, not McConnell headquarters. Because it's Trump who delivered the state party to be in power. It is Trump that delivered a giant House majority. It is Trump who delivered a big Senate majority. So that way now the Senate grabbed a majority early on, but way before the House did, I believe, 1990 or so, somewhere around there. The state Senate did, Kentucky. But the House being such a big majority where now you don't even have to negotiate with Democrats, Trump delivers that. I think the farther you get away from Trump, the worse you do. They didn't have Trump come in and push for Cameron. They didn't have Trump get involved in the governor's election other than the endorsement of Cameron in the primary. Trump didn't make a visit to Kentucky. I know from insiders on that campaign, they were unsure if they really wanted him to. It wasn't until 2-3 weeks out from the election, they realized, oh man, we should get Trump in here, that they really started trying to schedule Trump. And of course, Trump's a busy guy. He's got a big schedule. He doesn't have time to come in. Like 3 weeks notice isn't enough time. You should have been scheduling that months out, but they weren't because they were unsure of how it would play out. I'm dead serious. They were unsure of how this would play out because of everything going on with courts with Trump and the primaries. So they didn't want to call Trump in to help get Cameron elected early enough and schedule it early enough to make a difference, to turn out the vote for Cameron. And what's funny is when Cameron loses, they then blame Trump too, even though Trump's the only one who's delivered them any kind of victory in Kentucky in years and decades. And yet, they don't want to say Trump did it. They hate him. They got to say it was McConnell. Because here's the thing, if Trump did it, if Trump is what delivered the state in such huge ways for the state house, state legislature, and Trump is what made the state so massively red, has now made us the majority Republican registration, the majority in Kentucky. Well, that means the things that Trump appeals to, the way Trump is what people want to see. Drain the swamp. Tamp down illegal immigration clearly. Get us out of all these endless wars. Stop doing the bidding of the deep state. Stop doing the bidding of the corporations. Stop being corrupt. Those are the kinds of ideas that Trump, pulls out and gets people excited about and gets people to vote that have never voted before, because generally they don't trust politicians and they don't trust them because there's nothing to trust them about. They definitely don't have your best interest at heart. But if they made that change, well, then they wouldn't be able to keep doing what they're doing, the corrupt stuff that they're doing. Selling themselves out to the corporations. I mean, look at this building fund donors list, okay? So these are the people who've given money to the Republican Party of Kentucky building fund to get it since 2022. Here's the top 10. This comes from the Kentucky Lantern, who grabbed this information from KREF, Kentucky Registry of Election Finance. This fund is registered with, so you can see who the donors are. And let's see who's giving them this money. First off, biggest donor they've had. Pfizer, $1 million. Pfizer gave them $1 million. And then on top of that, by the way, in case you didn't know, Robert Stivers, the Senate president of the Kentucky Senate, okay, so the leader of the Kentucky Senate, Republican, his wife, Regina Stivers, is the director of state affairs at PCMA. PCMA stands for the Pharmaceutical Care Management Association. It's basically a lobby on behalf of pharmaceutical companies and pharmaceutical distributors. So you wonder why we couldn't get anything done on vaccine mandates in Kentucky? You wonder why even Senator Alvarado, who's so part of the medical establishment that he left being a state senator in Kentucky to go be director of the state health board or whatever, the same as Dr. Stack for Kentucky or Fauci at the national level. He went to go do that for Tennessee. That's how part of the medical establishment he was. He tried to run a few bills to at least count natural immunity as the same as vaccine immunities when we're considering things like vaccine mandates and things at private employers, at universities and things. So he said, if you're going to mandate it, at least consider natural immunity the same. And here's a way to test for it. That bill wouldn't move. And you wonder, why can't that bill move? Well, on top of the Republican Party of Kentucky receiving $1 million from Pfizer, you have the Senate president's wife who's a lobbyist for the pharmaceutical companies. It's no wonder why it doesn't move. They're being paid to not do these things. And they're selling out, and then they wonder why. Oh, I wonder why we can't win hard elections. Why won't people turn out and vote for Cameron against Bashir? It's because you suck. All the things that the base wants you to do, you refuse to do. And then you're surprised they don't show up for you. They'll show up for Trump. Because he inspires them, at least. Even if sometimes he doesn't deliver, at least he inspires them. But you, on the other hand, you can't inspire them. You don't even know how to speak the language. You don't even pretend to try to do the things they want you to do. And sure, you'll keep winning your state house races and state senate races because mostly the voters don't pay as much attention, and the money you bring in, it might be enough for you to win those elections. But yet, as you're seeing, you lost how many elections that you dumped millions of dollars into? I mean, may I remind you that two out of 4 really heavily challenged by the conservative wing of the Republican Party put forward candidates to challenge incumbents. 2 out of the 4 races they put forward candidates, they won. And one of the 2 that they lost, man, it was like a 50-vote difference. It was close. Meanwhile, you flip to the other side, the establishment tries to run candidates, 7 or so candidates? 7 or so candidates against Republican conservative incumbents. And they lose by a landslide, spending way more money than they, like millions of dollars. They lose by landslides. They don't even come close. You think you'd realize, like, you're on the losing side. You're doing something wrong, but they don't. It's more we need to keep doing this dumb, stupid things. Because if they admit that what they're doing is wrong, well, what they're doing now comes with a lot of perks. You know? There's a lot of perks on this world. You know, you can have your nice fancy building that you can claim. Oh, wow. Sure, I sold out myself, but got my nice fancy building. We'll go through the rest of these donors real quick. NWO Resources, that's $500,000. That's a natural gas company, I do believe. AT&T gave him $300,000. Verizon $300,000. Metropolitan Life Insurance $300,000. Boeing Company $100,000. Beam $100,000. Churchill Downs $100,000. Philip Morris $100,000. Microsoft $100,000. Comcast $100,000. Keeneland $50,000. Delta Air $50,000. Jockey Club $50,000. And the Barbara Bank Revocable Trust $50,000. That's just some of their top donors into their. But I mean, obviously, a third of it is coming from Pfizer. No wonder. Here's something interesting. The Lexington, Kentucky does a burger week where it's burgers, these special burgers made around the city, and it's like a week long, and you can go around and try as many different burgers as possible. And this was first proposed, and for the several years after it was put out there, it was $5 burger weeks. I believe up until like 2020, it was $5 burger weeks. Now, this year's burger week's coming up, and they've announced the burgers are $7. $7, which those $2 difference may seem small, but keep in mind that is a 40% price increase in like 4 years. A 40% price increase in 4 years. That is some pretty massive inflation. I had this I wanted to discuss on the Herald Leader, had an opinion article from a pastor, quote-unquote pastor, called The Blasphemous GOP Push for Religion in Public Schools. Now, this pastor's out of Charlotte, North Carolina, but it's from Louisville. That's why the Herald Leader went ahead and published this. And in it, this pastor, female pastor, goes on to talk about how, Florida is Louisiana, of course, put forward Ten Commandments situation, Florida allowed pastoral counselors in schools. And so the Church of Satan said, okay, we're going to sign up to be pastoral counselors. And Ron DeSantis came out and he said, no, Church of Satanism, that's not a religion. And of course, she takes issue with that. Let's deal with that claim first real quick. I'm going to jump around within the article here, but quoting now from the article. I do not want DeSantis to be able to decide what is and what isn't a religion. For an agent of the American government to seize this kind of power is incredibly ironic, since this is precisely the kind of oppression that some European Christians were fleeing when they settled in the New World. It wasn't that they were prohibited from being Christians, it was their government had declared that their understanding of Christianity wasn't a legitimate religion. Okay, few things here. First, for those of you who are unaware, all the time you have to prove to your government that your religion is a legitimate religion and you have a sincerely held legitimate religious belief. We ran into this during COVID when people would say, I can't take the COVID vaccine because it goes against my religion. And then you'd be forced to basically have to argue that your religious belief is sincerely held and a real religious belief. So this isn't per se new. Also, it is important to set aside and point out the Church of Satan isn't the same as the Satanic Temple. The Satanic Temple is the ones who are advocating for this, and Satanic Temple isn't a religious belief. It's an advocacy group. Like literally, if you go to their About Us page, the Satanic Temple page, it says, the mission of the Satanic Temple is to encourage benevolence and empathy, reject tyrannical authority, advocate practical common sense, oppose injustice, and undertake noble pursuits. It doesn't talk anywhere about religion or about God. Their About Us is full of nothing but things, advocacy side things. It's just a leftist advocacy group. That's all it is. There is no religion. They don't proclaim to have a belief in God. Or a God, multiple gods, nothing. They literally are just a group that was formed in order to be a political advocacy group. So you can't, that's not a religion. It has no set of religious beliefs or religious practices. It has no belief in higher power or God. Like, that's just it. So I guess the argument there is atheism a religion? That's really the argument. And DeSantis says, no, the lack of a religion cannot be considered a religion. Period. And that's the argument to have. But to somehow claim that, well, he's claiming the Church of Satan or Satanic Temple isn't a religion. Well, I don't want my government just declaring something isn't a religion. Well, you kind of do, though, to a degree. You don't want child sacrifice. You want your government to be able to come and say, no, you can't do that. Now, so her point there is kind of stupid, I think, about, that it'll be worked out in the courts about what's a religion, what's not. And of course, the entire premise of this article, the separation of church and state, is inaccurate. That's not in our Constitution anywhere. If our founders believed that the government shouldn't have a religion that it follows and people shouldn't be religious within our government, if they wanted us to be free from God, they would have said it. Instead, the U.S. Constitution, it'll say things like year of our Lord in it. And in the Declaration of Independence, God does appear. But, and just about every single state constitution also references God or the divine. So, it's in there. If they didn't want God to be a part of it, then they would have said so. But instead, they kind of did the opposite. Now, granted, I do agree with the writer's point, though. There is a point that she makes about not wanting her math teacher talking to her kids about the Ten Commandments. That's a point I made. That's why I'm actually against the putting up of the Ten Commandments in our public schools. Because, these are people. Right now, we have to literally pass laws to get these people to take pornography out of the public library, out of the school libraries. We had to pass laws trying to get them to stop teaching kids to hate one another based on their skin color. Like, that's a real thing. That's what critical race theory is. That's what DEI is. And we're trying to pass laws to deal with that. You know, we've got counselors in Lawrenceburg facilitating gay relationships behind kids' back. We literally have a Department of Education that says you're not to tell parents when their kids cross-dressing at school, don't tell the parents. And yet you want them talking to your kids about the 10 Commandments? I don't think so. That's not how I want it to be. That's why I'm against it being in there, because I don't trust these people. Get away from my kids. Don't talk to my kids about religion. I barely trust you to teach them math and reading, and you can barely do that. But this person, this pastor, so-called pastor, takes it a step too far. She does call it blasphemous. So she says this in the article, quoting here, I pastor a church and we don't display the 10 Commandments on any of our walls because honestly, it's kind of idolatry. The idea that displaying God's words on a wall is not idolizing God? What kind of pastor? What? So for those of you who aren't keeping up here, okay, so, you know, there's definitely arguments could be made that if you are worshiping, that displaying a cross or displaying a figure of Jesus or Virgin Mary or so on and so forth is idolizing things above God. But the 10 Commandments are God's word. Unless this pastor is trying to claim that she believes that the 10 Commandments handed down to Moses are not from God, but from humans. You cannot, if you're idolizing God's word, you're idolizing God. It's not idolatry to worship God's word. It'd be idolatry to worship a figure of God more than God's word. What are you talking about? What kind of church is this? I mean, you disagree with me. You can email me, info@theandrewshow.com if you disagree. If you think that displaying the 10 Commandments and holding the 10 Commandments as special or displaying them and reading them is somehow idolizing something before God, email me your argument. Because I'd love to hear it. Because I don't understand how displaying God's word is somehow a form of idolatry. Or, as she says, it's a kind of idolatry. I'd love to hear the argument. Because she doesn't really actually explain how that's idolatry. Never comes up. Well, y'all, that's what we got time for today on the Andrew Cooperrider Show. Thank you all so much for joining me. Back here tomorrow. Hope you have a great rest of your day.